Andrew, last week, Tom and Mark introduced us to the concept of the yoke. And we finished with this statement that our greatest calling in life is not to accomplish great things, but to be an apprentice of a great person.
Which is this beautiful truth that I believe and I teach, and yet it's one thing to say God invites you to this relationship of intimacy. It's a totally different thing to actually feel and experience it. And I know in my own life, when I think about the yoke, I often feel either one, God isn't near, I don't feel that, or two, I don't need him. And only in my most desperate moments do I actually want to invite him into my daily life. And I would also add, as a pastor, when we talk about this image of the yoke, this idea of an intimate apprenticeship with Jesus, one of the immediate pushbacks or questions I get is, well, I just don't feel that. I get that God wants to tell me what to do with my life. Right. That makes sense to me. But does he actually want to be a part of my life? Does he want to walk alongside me in this? And if so, why does it feel so impossible?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, you really hit on something really important, that one of the greatest longings of all of our hearts is intimacy. We long to know and to be known. And from the biblical story, this is hardwired into us. When we look back at creation, not only as a God of intertrinitarian relationship, but we were created in his image for relationship. For example, even the language early in Genesis that we're made in his image, and that means all kinds of things, right? That we're an image bearer. It's hard to get our hands around that thing. But one of the things it means is we not only reflect or we like him in some ways, but deeply embedded in this Hebrew idea of image bearing is connectedness. It's not just reflection, it's connection. So we deeply long for intimacy, to know and to be known. And we were created with that in mind. So it's not surprising that this gap we feel is this gap between how we were created to live and how we live. And we long for that intimacy.
Yeah, so why is there this gap? I mean, maybe talk a little bit. I mean, this life we long for includes this connection, this relational intimacy. Why don't we experience it?
And when you read Genesis 1 to 3, chapters 1 and 2 really does highlight this. We were created for intimacy, and in that garden, we experienced it in a way that I can't even relate to right now. And that's why Genesis 3 is so important. And whenever I'm tempted to blame God for this feeling of distance that I often do experience with him, or as I pastor others in that, I have to remember Genesis chapter 3. And it's a tragic story of when Adam and Eve sin, they run. They run and they hide from God. And there's this really painful picture in Genesis chapter 3 of God walking in the garden, looking for them and calling out their names. And they've run and they've hidden. So this gap we feel started with us. It didn't start with God. Whenever I can't experience his presence, I have to remember I ran. We ran.
And isn't that the good news that we cherish? Is not only understanding there's bad news of our distance and hiding from God and this lack of intimacy, but the biblical story leads us back to intimacy. In fact, God runs to us. In the Genesis story, we are sort of kicked out of the garden, and now in this great invitation, we're invited back to this garden life of intimacy. And we see this in different ways in the New Testament, and the great invitation, again, gives this picture of experiencing the intimacy we were created for. One of the examples of this metaphor is not only the yoke metaphor, but the vine metaphor. Mm-hmm. It's a horticulture metaphor, and it's found in John chapter 15. And the context of Jesus, think about this, the disciples were feeling really fearful because they'd been with Jesus in intimacy for 3 years, and Jesus says in John 14, I'm going to leave. Help, right? I'm going to be gone. And they feel this distance and there's fear. And in that context, Jesus gives them this hopeful teaching in John 15. I'd like to read just a couple of verses because it's really at the heart of this great invitation. And Jesus says in John 15, it's just amazing what he says when he invites him into intimacy, even though he's leaving. He says, abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. And then he says, notice, I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. And I love this picture because notice the progression. He invites us to intimacy, And in that intimacy, then that fruitfulness, that life of significance, of joy, comes out of intimacy. I see that in relationships. You do too, right? That the hardcore reality of relationships is seeking intimacy. I think that in marriage. I've been married a long time, and Liz has put up with me a long time. But one of the things after 30, yeah, I know you have to. But after 30 some years of marriage, I'm learning more about intimacy, and the joy of marriage grows as intimacy deepens, and the fullness of that. And we become like each other. You ever seen older people who've been married? I'm one of the older people. They actually look alike, talk alike. And not only is there intimacy, there's transformation in that intimacy, and we see that in the Great Invitation.
I love the picture of the relationship and the intimacy of, human to human, but how do we, Andrew, kind of wrap this up for us. How do we actually experience that type of intimacy with the God of the universe?
Right, and I can't let us off the hook here because, I've used an illustration like that before, but there's really just no getting around this, that I can't sit down with Jesus and have a cup of coffee with him. There's something different about that relationship, even in the midst of this promise of intimacy, that we have to take seriously. How do we relate to a person we can't see and we can't touch? Two things give me hope there. The first is that Jesus did come near. And this invitation, this yoke, was so important to him. He came and invited me. He said, Andrew or Tom or Kevin, come to me and I'll give you rest. Granted, it was 2,000 years ago, but he did. He came. It was that important to him.
We ran.
And he came. Number two is that we really do have access to him in prayer. And that's why this discipline is so important to the life of an apprentice. Jesus promises, when you pray, I hear you. You have access to me. And there's this wonderful promise, actually, here in John 15 that Tom just talked about. And you'll notice in those verses, Jesus says, abide in me, remain in me, as I remain in you. He's not going anywhere. He says, I'm with you in this, so stay with me, remain with me, I'm here. And it reinforces to me something that's really important. Jesus does not promise you will feel me with you all the time. He doesn't promise that we'll feel his presence. And there are times in our lives where we won't. There are times where we will, but there are times in our pain. Mm-hmm. We've all been there. In our loss, we feel that gap again. We really do. But Jesus doesn't promise we'll feel his presence. He promises that we'll have it. And that's where faith comes in. I have to trust in those moments as an apprentice that I can take Jesus at his word, that he's there. That when I'm speaking to him in prayer, when I'm practicing that discipline, even when it's the last thing I feel like doing, he's listening. He promises to be there. And that by doing that, I can not only live this life of intimacy, but I can train with him in the yoke.